Okay, folks, let's begin. The papers. Started grading them on Fridays, saved them to a flash drive. Had an absolute disaster with the flash drive on Saturday. Lost pretty much all the documents that I've been working on, so then I started going through and redoing them yesterday. Some of you may have received papers back from me already, but essentially it's put me back about 2 days on the grading, so don't expect these things back until probably Friday. All right, just, I mean, I'm working on them and I'll just be getting them back to you as I finish them. Instead of saving them to a disk and then trying to send them all back at once, just learned my lesson on that one. I'm just gonna grade it and send it back, grade it and send it back, okay? So so if you get a paper from me in the next couple of days, great. Expect everyone should have a paper by Friday. So I apologize for that little snafu. Today, I did plan on talking to you about the kind of consistencies of errors that I've seen in the paper so far. Nothing out of the ordinary so far, but I've only seen about 10% of the class assignments. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wait and talk about those errors on Wednesday. All right, and we'll kind of try to make a checklist of these things so that you know what to look for in the future. So what I want to do today is I want to talk to you about getting started on paper number 2. All right, so let's talk about what paper number 2 actually asks you to do and then what your responsibilities are. If you take a look at the syllabus, you don't have to look at the syllabus, but you'll see that paper number 2 is due at the end of October on 30th. Or I'm sorry, on end of September on the 30th, which is not far away. And the course, as you know, is going to move quickly. You're going to need to understand some things about paper number 2 and how you're going to get it done in order for you to do the kind of critical thinking that we need you to do in order to participate in these types of assignments. So let's talk about what the assignment does first. I want you to think about a condition. I want you to come up with something that you would see in your profession, something that would probably be garden variety type of condition that you would face in your practice. So you're not going to be surgeons, right? You're not going to be neurologists, but you may deal with people who are recovering from surgery. You may be dealing with people who are trying to avoid surgery. You may be dealing with people who are working on musculoskeletal issues associated with a neurologist's orders, right? So my point out of all of this is that you need to be looking at conditions that are relevant to you, right? I mean, if you're in physical therapy, right, you're not doing surgery. So when I give you the assignment here, picking something that is a surgical procedure to investigate is probably not relevant to your field. So the job that you have here is to think about a condition that's relevant to your field and to then look at 2 treatment options that are available for that particular condition. And I want you to do some reading, right? I want you to kind of sift through the databases. I want you to get into the literature, right? Look at the research. Start thinking about what treatments are relevant to your condition. When you do that, I want you to find one article that supports one treatment and one article that supports the other treatment. Once you find an article that supports, now, one of the things I'm going to tell you here, avoid review articles. In other words, if you find a systematic review or if you find, an article that summarizes a whole bunch of research studies, right, I want you to avoid those. What I want you to do is I want you to find an article that has data, that has a study that actually looks at patient performances and charts progress or lack of progress, whatever it is that you're looking for. So that by the time you're looking at these research studies, and you figure out what they're doing in the studies, And if you read enough about your condition, and I would encourage you to just go, into those really informal places like WebMD or something like that to read about your condition, right? I mean, if you're studying something like osteoarthritis, right? Most of you in physical therapy are going to be dealing with, people who are struggling with osteoarthritis. You need to know what it is, right? So if you don't know what it is, if you don't know how to evaluate, if you don't know what the condition actually is and what treatment is going to do for it, then how are you supposed to evaluate whether the treatments are successful or not, right? For example, let's talk about osteoarthritis for a second. Let's just, diagram it out. Okay, most of you know, let's just talk about osteoarthritis of the knee, right? Most of you know, right, that osteoarthritis is essentially, here you have bone structure, right, on both sides, and you have a cartilaginous substance that goes over top of your bones. You have this encapsulated, right? You have tendons and things running over here. You've got your kneecap and all. You've got this viscosity created by fluids in here, right? That's what a knee joint looks like. But over time, this surface begins to wear away because of impact, right? And eventually we end up with, in severe cases, bone-on-bone contact, in which we create all sorts of inflammation, right, swelling, and pain, right? So if that's what osteoarthritis is, and most of you in here are physical therapists, right? So everybody not physical therapists? Yes, all physical therapists? Not a physical therapist? What do you? Say that again?
Athletic training.
Athletic training. Same kind of thing applies. So when you think about treatment here, what is a physical therapist going to do, right? If you're thinking about treatment for osteoarthritis, you're not going to resolve this bone-on-bone contact problem, right? The only way you're going to resolve the bone-on-bone contact is probably to, cut here, and put a new joint in, right? Or to develop some kind of pillow, right? Or, replace that cartilaginous substance in there so that you have that shock absorbing system. Does physical therapy replace joints? Does physical therapy reproduce cartilage to put inside that joint surface? No. So what are some common treatments for osteoarthritis then? What kind of, let me just think about this. What is the goal of treatment for osteoarthritis then for people in your field, in your profession? And you don't have to be a physical therapist to know this or to even be able to contribute to this to athletic trainers, right? You can figure this out. So what's the goal?
Pain relief.
Pain relief. All right? So I want pain to decrease. What are some other things that we'd want to do for osteoarthritis treatment?
Increase your range of motion.
Increase your range of motion. Those are pretty good, right? Because we know that once this starts to become painful, right, that the musculature will tend to tighten up around it, right? And then it reduces the flexibility of the joint. Anything else we want to do? Yep.
You don't want it to affect anything else.
What do you mean?
Like if they're limping and then it causes pain on their left knee or their other knee or whatever.
Quality of life issues? Is that what you're talking about? Right. I mean, can they function? Right? Maybe it's not quality of life. Maybe it is more of an issue of function or functionality. It's a pretty good list to start with, right? Once you know what it is that you're trying to accomplish, now you can start to look at the treatment options in order to figure out how these treatment options address these factors, right? What I need you to do
is in order to begin a conversation about paper number 2, in that introduction, right, you're going to establish, look, there's 2 different treatment options for this, and you're going to describe in general what they are, and essentially you're going to get to that thesis, which is you're going to have to make a point here of saying that A is better than B is better than A, right? That's where you need to be, right? That's going to be your thesis. You're going to have to choose one of the treatment options, A over B or B over A, right? You're going to have to figure that out based on the criteria, right? Based on the evidence that's provided in here, but the evidence doesn't make any sense. What if I just told you to go out and do this? Most of you would write a summary of one article, a summary of another article, and say, hey, I like this one better. That's not a reasoned argument. What you need to do is you need to establish what we term here an operational definition. In other words, there is a list, there's a set of criteria, there's something that needs to happen in order for us to claim that treatment is successful. We have to evaluate these things. Look, I can come up, let's pretend for a second that, let's think about physical therapy as a treatment option, and let's think about something like NSAIDs or pharmaceutical treatment. If we're comparing these, right, what would pharmaceutical treatment do to increase range of motion? We know it's going to decrease pain, right? If we take NSAIDs, they're anti-inflammatory agents, right? All they're going to do is simply reduce the amount of inflammation there, which is going to reduce the pain. Does that reduction in pain automatically increase range of motion? It may increase it some, just because there's no pain there. So now I have to ask myself, well, where do I need my patients to be in these categories, right? If I'm going to say that I need to reduce pain, how do I know if my treatment is successful? Yeah.
You would need like a group taking pain medication and one without, and seeing if like there's a...
So you're just comparing them against each other. Is that a fair argument? If you're just looking at one treatment and looking at another treatment, and you're just trying to figure out if one gets better results or maybe moves further on the pain scale than the other, is that a reasonable treatment to say that this is a better treatment for osteoarthritis? You're shaking your head no. Why not?
You want to try and get as many goals as possible.
You want to reach a particular standard, don't you? I mean, if all we're doing, let's say you're taking a study and you've got patients who are reporting a score of 8 on a scale of pain scale, and they reduce down to a 7. But somebody else in their group has an average score of 7 and they reduce to a 6. Does the 6 win? No, why not? They both only reduce by 1 point on the scale, right? So if they only both reduce by 1 point, one went from an 8 to a 7, one went from a 7 to a 6, right? How different is a 7 from a 6 in that pain scale? Not very different, right? They're both in that kind of moderate range because pain is such a subjective measure, right? If I'm treating osteoarthritis patients, right, and look, I'm not talking about these types of patients because when they're at the severe range, you're probably not doing physical therapy anymore, right? You're probably not doing what you need to do. This is going to require surgery. So you're dealing with patients who have moderate to mild pains. So if they're in that mild to moderate pain, let's put the scale up here, right? 1 to 10. There's the midpoint. So if they're in that moderate range, where do I need them to be when they finish treatment? Anybody? Where? 2 to 3? So you wanted to move here?
The patient feels they can...
Wouldn't I want no pain if I'm a patient? Right? If you're a patient, you go into treatment and say, hey, you know what? I just want to reduce my pain. I really don't want no pain. Yeah, let's just take it down a notch. What patient isn't gonna want that?
Well, like for some, if you have osteoarthritis at to like a certain point, like I know in some observation hours, like patients would come in and say, like, I know like there's no chance of me getting
That's
down to
right.
0.
That's right, okay, so it's understanding what what expectations are possible, right? Getting to a 0 or a 1, let's just take that 1 out of there and just put 0 here, right? Getting to 0 is probably not reasonable. So this is why you have to do some reading about your condition to find out just exactly what treatments can do, right? Because essentially what you're trying to do is manage the pain. Make it better than it was. Well, that's a pretty shifty goal, isn't it? How do you set standards for that? If all we're doing is just reducing pain from, let's say, the mid-range of 4, 5, 6 down to 2, 3, that doesn't seem like a very meaningful change. Pain's pretty subjective to measure, right? A lot of factors come in on pain. If you ask someone to rate their pain right now, right, different people are going to respond in different ways. I had the unfortunate experience of spending some time with my mother-in-law this weekend, right, who was describing her hip pain as excruciating, right? Like 9 out of 10 on the scale, 10 being amputation, right? And I'm thinking to myself, there's no way she's at a 9 on a pain scale, right? Not my 9. Her idea of pain is much different than mine. So pain is subjective. So how do we deal with pain when we're looking at research, right? All of you are sitting out there talking about science, and we have all these numbers, and we have all this research with statistics and everything that shows that we're getting changes in our patients. You're saying this is king, right? Well, how are you able to provide science to study something like pain? How do we do it? Right? Because that's essentially the research in your area is all going to be about, hey, we're managing pain, we're moving it down the scale. How do we know if we've got all this variability? How do we know? What can we do in a scientific study to show some reliability in those types of scores? What can we do? Think about it. How, if you were conducting a study, if I was asking you to conduct a study, what would you do in order to figure out if your patients were actually moving on a pain scale?
Like if they can do things that they weren't able to do when they're at high.
Well, no, now you're talking about functions, right? That's a completely different category. Right? We're talking about pain.
I know in like a lot of physical therapy offices, they do like at your first initial meeting, you fill out paper and every rating your pain, rating like what you can do, what you can't do, where is pain, and every time you go back, you have to fill out that paper.
That's right. That's right. Okay. So that's one way of doing it. You're charting it across time, but essentially, is that still reliable? Right? I mean, what's the difference? Can you explain to me? I mean, many of you are using language, right, in your papers, and you're writing about, oh, this is a very meaningful outcome. And I'm circling the word very, and I'm going, what does that mean? Tell me what meaningful is. If a patient is reporting a 6 on 1 week and reports a 5 the next week, can you differentiate for me that change? Can you tell me how meaningful is that change? What's the matter? You don't like talking about this? It kind of makes you uneasy, doesn't it? What would you do? How do you figure, what kind of science can you apply to this to get some answers? Think about it. You can't just study one patient, right? Because one patient doesn't make an argument. You know, people were bringing up examples in their paper, well, I read this article and there was this patient who was prayed for and she recovered. And I'm like, so what? Doesn't mean anything. It's one patient. One patient does not provide reliability. We're not going to go around and make decisions about how we're going to change our practices of medicine based on one patient's reaction to something. So we have to study groups, right? We have to get that randomization to the groups. We have to have a big enough number so that we can look to say that, all right, now if we take the group, if we take maybe the average in the group and look at the average change in the group, that if everybody's moving down the scale, well, then that probably means that there's some reliability there. That's how we do it, because then we look at the group, we look at the numbers, and we think everybody is changing, or the majority of people are changing. If you think about all the factors that are going into these people's lives, right, and we're looking at what they're doing for their treatment, we can pretty much realize that, okay, the only thing responsible for the change of this entire group of people would be the treatment. That's how we figure things out. That's how we can apply statistics to it, because we can say there's probably nothing else that would make this entire group of people change their perspective on their pain. So now the statistics can come in and verify that. You can put numbers to it. Establish reliability. Range of motion. How are we going to study that? First of all, what's our goal? Mr. Goals?
Increase range of motion.
To what? If you're going to set a standard, right? If you're going to say we're going to increase range of motion, how do we figure out if we're successful? I mean, if I have whatever this is, 75 degrees of range of motion, is going to 80 degrees of range of motion successful in treatment? I don't know. So what's the goal?
It have to be specific to like one location, like and you'd have like if a certain joint, like your elbow is supposed to move, like it can move 180 degrees, like from here to here. Like you would have to know how much of a change for each patient based on.
Wouldn't we want to know? You're thinking about change. I'm thinking about, let's start with what's normal, right? Why don't we figure that out first? Just like we know that pain has a scale of normality of 0, right? We want people to be at 0. Same thing with range of motion, right? If we know what normal is, now we can start figuring out that, okay, maybe we're not going to get to normal. So now what is a reasonable expectation?
Like if you're treating a 60-year-old patient, you would look at the data from a group of 60-year-olds
Sure.
and whenever they can reach.
Sure. So this is something that's going to affect your introduction here, right? Establishing a patient population, right? Because if you're going to find a treatment that is for 60-year-olds and a treatment that's for 25-year-olds, right? There's no reason to compare those because your patient population is entirely different. So you need to think about, all right, well, if I'm going to look at these treatment options, like I've got to be comparing apples to apples, right? Just like you wouldn't compare a surgical treatment to a physical therapy treatment because surgery has an entirely different set of outcomes and expectations than physical therapy does. Right? Surgery plans to chop this out, give you a new one. So it doesn't have the same goals. Do you understand what I'm doing here? Right? Before I read one article about treatment, I'm trying to figure out just what I'm trying to accomplish, right? When I go to read those research articles, I need to figure out what the goals are so that I can look at the research and say, okay, they either did or did not reach the goals. What many people do, right? This is what happens, right? Ignorance is bliss. People pick up research articles and they read it and they see that the research is demonstrating success and they go, oh, look at that, it works. No, it doesn't. Not unless it meets what our expectations are. Just because someone can show change in a patient population doesn't mean that they're showing an acceptable change, right? So your job, before you pick up that, before you start researching and looking at the articles, you need to research about your condition to figure out, what is my expectation? What are the goals that I need to reach? And once you figure out what those goals are, then you can establish that operational definition, which for something like pain and range of motion, we know that there are ranges of 0 in pain or normal in range of motion where we would say, aha, right? We're pretty close to that. So if my range of motion for my shoulder is 75 degrees after my treatment, and I go to 80 degrees, and I know that 90 degrees is the goal, well then, hey, 80 degrees, that's pretty good. I'm pretty close. I could consider that to be successful. But if I go from 75 degrees to 76 degrees, is that successful? I don't know. So with these two, right, these are very quantitatively measured. We know what the numbers are. Even though pain may be qualitative in nature, we can quantitate it on a scale. Can we do that with functionality? Can we do that with quality of life? Sure, we can make scales up, right? There's quality of life scales out there, there's functionality scales out there, and they ask people, can you reach up into the cupboard and bring down a jar of peanut butter and open it? Right? They ask you those kind of things. Can you walk up and down a flight of stairs without feeling unstable or falling down? Right? They ask very specific questions about what you can and can't do, and then they chart that on a range. Never, sometimes, many times, always, right? You ever see those scales, right? When you get those surveys, right? And you get, when you do it, how many times do you do it, right? It's all because they're quantifying out. There's only 4 answers. There's 25, if 50% of the population shows up in one of the areas of the range, and you see that 50% of the population move down into, from sometimes to never, right? Then all of a sudden you think to yourself, well, half the patient population is doing well here. But let me ask you something. If 50% of the population moves, is that successful? What about the other 50%? If half the population, let's just say some of the population gets to where you want it to be, what about the others? I mean, we know that medicine is somewhat unreliable, right? Different people are going to respond differently to different treatments. So if half the people move in a study, is that good? If half the people get to where you want it to be, is that a good result? I don't know. Maybe. Maybe not. If 30% move, depends on what the treatment is, right? If you're trying to treat an incurable form of cancer, and 10% of the people are successful in the treatment, you're probably jumping up and down saying, hooray, we're getting somewhere. But if only 50% of people are responding to pain management with physical therapy, you're probably thinking to yourself, man, we're really not doing too well. Because we should be able to control people's pain. What I love to do is I love to look at these studies, right? Whenever there's a study out there about pain, right? And they're actually asking people to, perform certain functions or something like that, right? They're asking them to float around a pool or do something, right? And to read that study carefully and to find out that they allow the patients to take anti-inflammatory medications while they were doing the study. How can you determine if the patient's pain is being reduced by the anti-inflammatory medication or by the treatment that's being applied? How would we know? Can we do something like that? Can we, if we're measuring pain and we're allowing patients to take pain medications and we're not really studying if pain medications are the factor, right? We're studying if, let's say, physical therapy is producing the results, right? But we're allowing the patients to take pain medication. Does that ruin the study? Does that make the study unreliable? It all depends. If everybody's taking pain medications, well, then maybe if everybody's moving on the scale at a greater rate than those people who normally aren't taking pain medications, well, now we can see, hey, maybe this, the movement is relevant to the treatment. What I need you to do is that I need you to be critical thinkers when you're reading these articles, right? Don't just buy it because somebody wrote it. I need you to look at these studies and to be able to determine whether they make sense or not. You know going in that every study is going to be faulty. Every study's got weaknesses and problems. We know that going in. What you need to figure out is how damaging the weaknesses and faults are. How relevant are they to establishing whether you can decide if it's meeting your operational definition or not? Because the worst thing you can do is perpetuate ignorance. To find a bad study out there and to say, hey, look at this. This is really good. Look at the answers they're getting. We're going to follow this. Right? We don't need people being misled. We don't need people making bad decisions in medicine. We need people who can think, who can read the research and say, all right, this is what this means. It may have some validity. It may have some reliability. Doesn't have all the answers. Or you might look at it and say, look, this thing really doesn't mean much at all. On Wednesday, I want you to bring 2 articles in. So between now and Wednesday, I want you to bring 2 articles in so we can sit down and we can start talking about, I'll ask you, what's your condition? You can tell me what your condition is, and I can say, all right, what's your operational definition? What are your standards? What's going to be your categories to determine success? And we as a class can look at those categories and say whether we like it or not, whether we agree or not, whether we find it to be valid or not. Those are reasonable expectations. You don't have to be a physical therapist. You don't have to be a medical practitioner of any kind in order to read and understand research. All you have to be is a good reader and a critical thinker. Break it down. Figure out where the problems are. Get some help with the statistics, right? Because in all of this, all we're trying to do, we're trying to validate it, right? We're trying to make sure that the treatment is the thing that caused the change. When you look at the statistics in those charts, right, we'll put some of your charts up and we'll look at all the data and we'll look at the p-values and the confidence intervals and all the other changes, that they're or the data that they're providing for statistical validation. We'll look at all that and we'll find out where are the good parts and where are the bad parts. And you'll find that they're doing ways of they're sometimes manipulating the data. They're grouping things together in order to make the changes look better than maybe they actually are. So by Wednesday, figure out a condition and find 2 articles. Now, the finding of the 2 articles, if I'm looking for a condition and I'm looking for treatment options for a condition, I'm going to go to Cochrane. Right? The database that I showed you in the very first week of class, right? The Cochrane Review gives you a lot of comparative studies, right? It shows I mean, it gives you the summaries. It tells you what the scientists found when they compared the research out there. But at the end of the day, what you can do is you can go to the bibliography and you can start looking at the studies that they used, and maybe you can go find one or two of those articles. Or you can go into our library databases. If you know what treatments you're after, right, to look to see. I mean, one of the things that I want to talk to you about on Wednesday, and we'll do a little bit more of it on Friday, I just want to make sure that you're comparing apples to apples. That many of you are going to find out that the treatments that you have may not be comparable because they don't intend to do the same thing. So you need to find treatments that have similar goals. I'm not saying that you need to find treatments that have the exact goals. You just need to find treatments that, if you're dealing with a non-invasive treatment in one category, you probably have to have a non-invasive treatment in the other category, and they need to be targeting the same actions. They may do it in different ways. They may find different systems in the body to approach, but ultimately you're trying to reduce pain, increase range of motion. When I start to put together an operational definition, right, where I have standards like this, suddenly my magic dust, right, my idea of throwing sand on people or having people eat dirt or whatever to treat them doesn't hold up, because I'm not going to be able to produce any types of these results, right? I may get people to think qualitatively that they're better, but I probably am not going to be able to show statistically any valid changes. So when you're out there, right, do some background reading on your condition first. Figure out what it is that you've seen, what you like, what you understand. Go do some background reading on it. Start, putting together some ideas in your head that if you're a patient, you have this condition, what would you expect to see? What kind of transition and change would I need to accomplish in order for this to be considered a successful treatment? Then you're going to go look at the research articles. At that point in time, go to Cochrane, type in your condition, right? Osteoarthritis treatment options. Boom, up come a bunch of studies, a whole bunch of comparisons. You look at all those comparisons, look at all those treatment options, and at that point, go out there to find the research. So that when you begin to write, now look at 2 articles, that's it, right? Somebody's going to send me an email saying, hey, I found all these other studies, can I use these? No, I want you to use 1 article for one treatment option and 1 article for another treatment option. If you go, think about how reckless that is, right? If you go out there and find 3 articles for one treatment option and 1 article for another treatment option, is that a fair comparison? No, you're building more evidence on one side than the other because you're cheating. You want one side to win. You don't have an agenda when you're in research. You don't want one side to win when you go into this. What you want is a clear mind that says, I want to figure out who's got better evidence. Because if you go in there with an agenda that I want to support physical therapy, right, you're already biased. And now you're cheating. You can't do that. You have to be able to understand what's legitimate and what's not, even if it's in your own profession. So go into this with a reasonable expectation of what goals should be, no matter what the treatment, and then find 2 articles. And now, when you find those 2 articles, comes the scrutinizing. You need to look at those 2 articles to find out where the article has weaknesses, where are its flaws, where are its problems, where's the information that's legitimate, where's the strength of this article, how they do it, how they control for these variables, how do we know that those data that they're providing are accurate and reliable. You need to start asking all those questions, because if you're just going to read things and agree with whatever people write, you're going to get taken advantage of. Come see me, I've got a bridge to sell you. Right? Sucker born every minute. You're smarter than that. You got to be willing to read things, scrutinize what they actually mean, and then make your decisions off of that, right? If you have no idea what you're doing, you may want to come to class on Wednesday and be the first person to raise your hand and say, look, here's my 2 treatment options. I don't know what I'm doing. Okay? So when you write this paper, the production of the paper is going to be focused on the operational definitions, the goals, right? Because if you write a paper where you just summarize one article and then summarize another article, there's no comparison there. What you need to do is you need to go through now, if you've got, let's say, 4 categories for your operational definition, you need to have a paragraph on pain reduction. And you need to look at what the evidence for treatment A is and the evidence for treatment B, and you need to compare those pieces of evidence in order to determine that A is better than B or B is better than A in that category. You've got a thesis statement, right, that A is better than B or B is better than A. You need, by the end of this paragraph, to support that thesis statement in order for your paper to be unified. Same thing here. You know what your goal is for range of motion. You look at the evidence for treatment A, the evidence for treatment B, and you figure out which one's better. And you just consistently do this throughout every paragraph, looking at every item of your operational definition and doing the comparisons. Now, some articles, because you're only dealing with one article for each, some articles may not address some of these issues. Maybe they're only addressing pain. Maybe they're only addressing range of motion. Maybe they're only just these more qualitative factors down here. What does that mean? Does it mean that your study is weak? No. It just means your study focused on a very narrow set of criteria. What do you do in that situation? Well, you say, look, they didn't contribute anything here. They didn't contribute anything here. But they did contribute here. They did contribute here. So now you ask yourself, what's the more meaningful criteria out of this list of 4? If I'm making a decision, what would I want to put more weight behind? What are the things that make the most meaning here? Because if you're focusing on these qualitative issues, are they more important than these qualitative issues? Are quantitative issues up above? What's more valid, the quantitative or the qualitative? Obviously the quantitative, right? If we can look at hard numbers, especially something like range of motion, where you can measure degrees of extension and flexion, right? And you see changes, hard numbers that change from this point to this point. Well, that's a pretty good measure of success, isn't it? That, this, that, they might not be so measurable. So you've got to figure out, right, that there are some modes of evidence here that are stronger than others. So if you've got a study that just is focused on range of motion and another study that's focused on pain, quality of life, and function, more qualitative effects, I'm probably going to put my weight behind the quantitative study and not these qualitative issues. Because that is more measurable, that's more reliable. Even though I've got more evidence in the qualitative end, it's not as strong. I can validate this. I have a tough time validating these. Any questions about what you're doing?